So now we will be having panel 8B titled Alternative Readings of Colonial-Era Texts. Our first speaker will be Ana Melinda Testa-de Ocampo of the University of the Philippines, Diliman, presenting Reading Pigafetta and Magellan, Tropes of a Travel Narrative in the 16th Century. Our second speaker will be Dr. Olivia Ann M. Habana from the Ateneo de Manila University, presenting Transforming Betrothal and Marriage Practices in the 16th to 17th Century Philippines. Our third speaker will be Christian Gil Benitez of the Ateneo de Manila University, presenting Rereading My Bagyo Mat My Rilim toward a tropical Traumaturgy. And our last speaker will be Christoffer Mitch C. Cerda of the Ateneo de Manila University, presenting 1872 to 1898, Uri at Kasarian sa gitna ng ekonomiyang pagbabago ng mga huling dekada ng ika-19 na siglo sa mga nobela ni Patricio Mariano. So, once again, may we remind everyone to mute and switch off their videos while the presenters are speaking, and questions will be entertained after all the speakers have finished their turns. With that, I'd like to turn the floor to Anna. Anna, are you ready?
Yes, good afternoon. Yes, the paper that I'm presenting will be on reading Pigafetta and Magellan, tropes of a travel narrative in the 16th century. In Theodore de Bry's allegory on the travels of Ferdinand Magellan, Magellan is in the middle of a Spanish galleon armed with an astrolabe that he must have used in his calculations of his position in the seas. Around him are the outstanding figures that Magellan ostensibly encountered during his expedition, like the Patagonian giant armed with bow and arrows, but who inserts an arrow into his mouth, a giant mermaid, strange looking creatures, a man and a woman semi naked save for a band of leaves covering their private parts, two people in the ocean with one hand held up towards the direction of the ship, Zeus on a cloud with the wind blowing, and a naked Apollo carrying a lyre looking directly at the viewer. Magellan is alone in his ship, seated at the table with the tools that he used for navigation. He is armed with three cannons and has an anchor, a broken mast, rope, and a keg around him. On the left side is land, the Tierra del Fuego, or the land of fires, with smoke rising from the ground, and straight ahead lies the vast Pacific Ocean. Although he is killed at Cebu, he shows us that the world is much bigger than the former explorers and map makers thought. Magellan is able to reach the east by sailing west. Antonio Pigafetta's account of the Magellan expedition is a landmark text in the history of Spain and the Philippines. It created an image of the islands of the West that Spain would later send later expeditions like those of Legazpi and Urdaneta. The study analyzes the tropes used in the narrative of the expedition. So I'm looking at the 5 tropes here: the marvelous, God in history, appropriation by naming and of space, baptism as medicine, and of course, resistance. Um, in comparatively, which is the field that I'm from, we're looking at the travel account as a text written by the European during the Renaissance, which has certain modes of writing of that particular period. So the trope is a device that involves a change or transference in meaning. So the form of the travel account actually has two. It's a medieval romance and at the same time a travel account, this account of Pigafetta. So the medieval romance typically entails a quest, a knight, or a band of knights. Then, of course, part of the process would entail the cleansing and preparation of the self before the quest through confession and the Mass. You would see this actually as a repeated action during the course of Magellan's expedition. Of course, allies to exist, enemies to overcome, and then, of course, it's episodic. The travel account is, of course, also episodic. The itinerary or the stops that are made during the course of the travel is what gives it its organizing principle. So, of course, there is the setting out, separation from the familiar. There's the trials, and then hopefully the return home or the fulfillment of the quest. So here we see the departure of the ship from Seville, Brazil, the Strait of Magellan, the Pacific Ocean, the crossing, and then after that, islands of Thieves, Cebu, and then on so forth until they return to Spain. Now, Antonio Pigafetta is also a supernumerary, meaning that he's educated, and you can see by his style of writing that he has similarities to what they call the medieval letter, and also he's well read because he's able to cite Pliny or even, let's say, Aristotle. Okay. Okay. So there are tropes which reoccur in medieval texts, but not so much here. But it does come out a little, but not as much. So, for example, the trope of the cannibal is a stereotype which occurs here in the first part near Latin America. So here, talking about the giants in Verzin, Pigafetta says they eat the flesh of their enemies not because they like the taste of it, but because of custom. So he elaborates on how it was developed. A woman sees the enemy who killed her son, and then she takes a bite out of his shoulder. And they don't eat the person systematically; they just do like piece by piece. So one week they eat one piece, another week they roast another section. Okay. Another recurring trope is actually the image of light. You'd see this actually in a lot of medieval Renaissance texts. The trope of light associated with God, especially in Dante's Paradiso. You see this also in the Catholic Church. For example, the imagery of the light streaming inside the church, that means that God is in the room. And then, of course, also the association of the devil with darkness, the transformation of his angelic form into a being with hooves, that he becomes black and horns and tail. So, as part of the medieval writing, you would see that the trope of light associated with God actually comes back here also. Okay. Anyway, so in the Marvelous, you see that the traveler tries to make sense of what he sees that is strange or unusual. Usually, the point of reference is something which is already familiar to them. So, for example, one of the things, if you notice, the leader is called a datu or a raja, but the closest association that the traveler can make is that he is a king. Of course, the datu or the raja is not exactly the same as the European king, but from the point of view of the traveler, it has to be associated with something familiar. Another, there is a marker, the island of Hierro, which goes back to Pliny, which shows a tree wherein the water comes from the bottom up to the sky. It's like a reverse rainfall. According to the Guillemard, it has a base of coral and other heavily foliaged evergreens condense the abundant water from the daily mist. Of course, there are a lot of the marvelous that Pigafetta looks at. So here you see the female bird that lays its egg at the back of the male, and then the eggs are hatched. The people of Virgin near the Antarctic are black men, all naked and shaved. They look like enemies from hell. So there you see the trope of associating a black man who is supposedly a heathen, and of course becoming an enemy from hell, who eats the flesh of men, not being good for food, but just simply for custom. And then trying to make sense of the swine with the navel at the back, birds with a spoon-shaped beak and no tongue. And of course, here when you see the sea otters, uh, for the first time they see sea otters, so it says it looks like it has the size and thickness of a calf, head like that of a calf, and small round ears, but it eats fish and it stays in the ocean, so he calls it the sea wolves. So the point of reference is something familiar to them, which is the otter, but then he calls this the point of reference is the wolf, so he calls them the sea wolves. The giant who had the picture here, who has a pain in his stomach, he puts an arrow down his throat to induce vomiting. So he vomits something of a green color, and when he has a headache, makes a large cut across his forehead. And then when one of the giants die, they say that 10 to 12 devils appear. The largest devil or Setebos appears for the giant. So, which is curious because Shakespeare actually uses the word Setebos in his play The Tempest. This is supposedly the god of Caliban. Then, of course, there's the Patagonian giants. Okay. Then here, of course, the Garuda carrying the elephant. That's one of the marvelous. Okay. Um, God in history. The Catholic beliefs and frameworks of the writers of these tribal narratives impinges on the text. Of course, some are missionaries, so definitely it would be there. But here, in the case of Pigafetta, it is shown by their belief that God controls history, that the world is unfolding according to his plan, even if we do not know it or comprehend it at this point. God is everywhere, even in nature, and His being imbues it with a special significance. So when they read the situation, for example, coming to the Philippines instead of Molucca, they were looking for the Isles of the West, it was part of God's plan to proselytize, to trade, and then, of course, to colonize. Here you would see that Pigafetta saying, "The great and marvelous things which God has permitted me to see and suffer during the long and perilous voyage which I have made." The invocation that God is always there to protect them comes out repeatedly in the text. So, for example, when they were near the Antarctic and there were very strong winds, they found a river of fresh water. But then, since the rapids are very strong, he says, "But God, by His grace, succored us that we were able to replenish and to confess." After that, and then add mass again, similar to the medieval romance. Okay, one of the most curious things actually is the Saint Elmo or the Corporo Sano. Okay. So Pigafetta cites actually that the body of Saint Anselm appears several times at the masthead. Then it becomes a lighted torch. The light becomes so strong, but then the assurance is that the ship will never perish. So you see here the reading of the situation that God sends the saints to protect using the trope of the light, which you see on the ship, and then the sea becomes calm again, and then it is a sign of divine protection. Okay, so then there's another appearance, of course, the three bodies of the saints. This is Saint Anselm, Saint Nicholas, Saint Clare, appeared to us masthead, and then, of course, after their appearance, the storm had ceased. God had come to protect them. Okay. And then after crossing the Pacific, they reached the Isle of Misfortune after 3 months and 20 days. It says, "If our Lord and Virgin Mother had not aided us by giving us good weather to refresh ourselves, we would have died." So the idea here is that Pigafetta giving meaning to the course of his actions or events because of the notion of God in history, who is supposed to be protecting them. And when they give the cross to Raja Colombo, he says to set at the cross on the top of the highest mountain, so that they might worship it. And if they did this, not thunder, lightning, or tempest could harm them. So as a mode of protection. Here, so you see the conflation of religion and political power and the object of the cross. God and the Spanish king bring. So, for example, Magellan said that he would bring soldiers to quell the enemies of Raja Colombo and make them subject to him, but by extension to Colombo and also to the Spanish king as the emperor of all Christendom. Magellan, after the baptism of the king of Mazawa and his family, asked, like, "Have you burnt the idols?" Says, then there was a sick man. He says, like, if the sick man had himself baptized, he would immediately be cured. And if this was not true, they could cut off his head. This is supposedly Magellan talking. So they, as a group, they went to the sick man's house. They spoke to him, and then they baptized him. And then after that, the speechless sick man was able to speak, and by the grace of God, he was well. And Pigafetta calls this the very manifest miracle of our time. So this is interesting. I'll go back to it. The point of the water being used for baptism as necessarily seen as conversion, or possibly could it mean something else? Okay. And then here, looking at this map, you'd see that the names are it is possible, of course, that the natives had their own names for their particular territories. But once the Spaniards name particular territories and it enters into the map, then into the archive, then into history, the native names are actually effaced, and the discourse of power is seen as the Spanish names are the ones that are kept. But of course, sometimes it happens that there may be a name that is given, but then it is not retained. So for example, for the particular names, example, after the mutiny in chapter 9, when they reach Port St. Julian, and after seeing the creatures, they put up a crucifix, and then they gave the name to the island Monte Cristo. When they reach here in the Philippines, it's not so much of the marvelous anymore because they're dealing with what they call the reasonable men who are ornately dressed. The reasonable men that they deal with have actually a kind of protocol. So there's an exchange of gifts, the provision of food, they take leave, they come back. So there is a kind of protocol being observed. So when they crossed to Humunu or Humanhon, they found springs of very clear water. They actually named it Aquade. But of course, no one would know that Humanhon was Aquade because it is the water of good science. Of course, they with a bit of the marvelous here in the Philippines. They said that they encountered the Capri. People have holes in their ears so large that you can pass their arms through the ears. Of course, the people were naked and heathen. And then after seeing the neighboring islands, calling them the archipelago of St. Lazarus. And then, of course, later on, it was called Filipinas. Villalobos naming Mindanao, later text, Cesares Caroli, but of course the name Mindanao is the one that stays. So naming is actually a kind of appropriation, as the native name, whether it is written in the Roman alphabet as Mignolo argues, or that it is completely erased and the Spanish name actually prevails. There is also the appropriation of space, although that's more in the later text. But for example, in a account of the missionaries, there is a rock in the Pasig in the Manila River, or I would assume the Pasig River, that the natives make offerings to, but then it is destroyed by the Augustinians, and then they put a shrine in its place. So the appropriation of a certain space, which is considered sacred by the natives, and in destroying it, and then putting a crucifix in order to mark it as a Catholic territory. Okay, so water as baptism and medicine. So baptism, yeah. Baptism as a rite of initiation into the Catholic religion is considered by the Spaniards as a successful conversion. It would seem that the natives perhaps had perceived this differently, perhaps as a rite of friendship, an effective medicine, or an immediate cure, rather than a strict religious conversion into the Catholic faith. And also at the same time, an oath of fealty to the Spanish king. I remember in one conference, someone asked me, why did the Filipinos convert so easily? You know, like the Spanish just came and then the next day they're all baptized and they all were just converted. Of course, we're not sure about the level of translation capability of Enrique and how much they actually understood what baptism meant. But it is a curious event that when baptism occurs, the assumption is that the natives are easily converted to a new religion and then therefore subsumed under the power of the Spanish king who was unknown to them. Is it possible, looking at the culture of water in that period, that water could have meant something else? So I tried to look for this, especially in folklore. So there's the Andaya study on the gods and goddesses, and Una Paredes on the delineation of identity for the Lumads. And then it's also possible, if they were practicing Muslims, that it's part of ablution or a kind of cleansing before prayer. Anyway, so I found this interesting text talking about during the time of Legazpi, saying that it was a purification process after a person was liberated from captivity. So he has to be cleansed. So a coconut is split into two, and the liquid poured over the head, and then later on he was cleansed again with the yolk of an egg. After that, he took a second bath and was considered consecrated and ready to be welcomed by family and friends. And the ceremony ended with the carousel. Okay. So um, if for devout Muslims, cleansing with water can be seen as ablution or a preparation for prayer, is it possible that the process of baptism was read more as a kind of medicine? You see this actually in later cases, for example, like even the one in baptism, or even in the later accounts, wherein a child is sick or an old man is dying. They tell him, bring him to the priest so he can be baptized. And then, of course, after baptism, he is miraculously cured. So perhaps the reading of water and the rite of baptism, not strictly as conversion, but possibly a kind of cleansing, or at best, even a kind of medicine or cure for a particular ailment. Okay. And then, of course, for resistance, yeah. So it would seem that the implications of the rite of baptism is a confluence of religion, power, and submission to a new authority were not understood fully. Reading native opposition or resistance to the cracks in the parchment curtain, uh, quoting William Henry Scott, is crucial. Otherwise, it would seem we had, in fact, wanted to be colonized and submitted willingly to it. So, in the section of Pigafetta, he talks about, of course, si Lapu-Lapu, and then how Magellan was killed. But anyway, I'm looking first at the how Magellan was portrayed in the text. Okay, so when Magellan is killed, Lapu-Lapu, Pigafetta describes him as a good captain and knight. So all of a sudden he becomes a knight, similar to the medieval romance. And then he says, so they slew our mirror, our light, our comfort, and our true guide. It says, the renown of so valiant and noble a captain will not be extinguished or fall into oblivion in our time. So you see that when Pigafetta writes it and tries to remember Magellan after his death with Lapu-Lapu, he refashions him as a knight. Of course, well, Pigafetta supported Magellan all this time, even during the time of the mutiny. But you see that how Magellan is now projected as a knight, of course, with a quest who does the regular confession and mass and prayer and all that. And then he's renowned and noble as a captain and is also as a good knight. Anyway, so just to conclude, so that I won't. Looking at the early travel accounts of this period, we can see that aside from the factual evidence that we can call from these sources, the framework and kind of narrative that the writer wants to tell are crucial. The proposal of the five tropes serve as a preliminary framework to critique these accounts. This is actually part of a bigger project. I'm trying to look at several writings across the 16th century if the tropes reappear. It offers a mode of reading the text, whether as known as a medieval romance or as a travel account, that were written in the European Renaissance context. So the marvelous takes two forms, of course, the expected monsters, the cannibals, extraordinary phenomena and creatures that they saw on the journey to the Americas and across the Pacific. Nature reflects the will of God. This is actually from Augustine, with the appearance of the saints at the masthead. So, of course, looking at St. Elmo's fire, and then the assurance that the ship will never perish after it appears. We see God in history as the Spaniards arrive at the islands that they named the archipelago of San Lazaro. It is a place to do his will, to proselytize, to trade, and of course to colonize. The appropriation of space initially began with the establishment of small crosses to delineate the Spanish presence to other travelers. You'd see this. So, for example, after the Strait of Magellan, there was one ship that was missing. So Magellan tells them, okay, so let's put a note, put it under the rock, and then put a cross so that whoever comes, you will know that the Spaniards were here. For the rocks, for the Portuguese, their markers actually a pile of stones. So initially, the cross is seen as a Spanish marker of their presence, but then it becomes a fixed sign of Spanish authority also. The Spaniards convinced the natives that the cross was a sign of friendship and protection from thunder, lightning, storms, and little did the natives realize that the cross was not just a symbol of God, but of Spanish colonization. Later on, of course, the encomienda system was imposed and forced labor and tribute began. So here, baptism as medicine, I have to admit, I'm still trying to do a lot more research on this. We need to study more clearly the meaning of water in our culture at that particular time. Because while the Spaniards may have read it simply as baptism, as automatically as conversion, perhaps if you're looking at water in Philippine culture, it may have been very different, aside from maybe ablution, cleansing, or even medicine. Then, of course, for resistance, starting with Lapu-Lapu and all the numerous revolts across the centuries of Spanish rule. Thank you.
Okay, good afternoon, everybody. After listening to that very interesting talk by Dr. Ocampo about Pigafetta, I will now move into I would say, context, but this time I will focus more on this transforming betrothal and marriage practices in the 16th to 17th century Philippines. Here. The nature of the indigenous family and its relationships were subject of great interest to the early Spanish missionaries. Chronicles of the religious orders detailed indigenous customs and practices such as burial, warfare, kinship, inheritance, and of course, marriage. So I will be looking more at this. Of course, this is part of a larger study, and I'm just going to focus down into these aspects. So my main research questions for the presentation this afternoon are the following. What were the common betrothal and marriage practices of the early contact period of the Spanish colonial Philippines? And how did Spanish religious authorities interpret and react to these practices? How did these affect Philippine societies of the time? My primary sources for the paper would be documents which are very familiar probably to most people, and these were written by Spanish colonial and religious officials of the time. So these are essentially Miguel de la Huerta, Morga, Chirino, etc. And I'm also using some Philippine epics and traditions. I will also look at other manuals, confessionarios, etc. But I will use these more for the larger study than for what I will be presenting today. Uh, betrothal. Betrothal was a practice that differed greatly for the Spaniards. The payment was often termed a dowry, but in reality, it is a bride price. So there are some quotes here that you may wish to read. Unlike in Western and other societies in which the bride's family gave a dowry to the husband, the opposite was observed in the Philippines. So Morga, writing about the Luzon area, says the dowry was furnished by the man, being given by his parents. The wife furnished nothing for the marriage until she had inherited it from her parents. Francisco Colin, writing of the Tagalogs in 1663, noted that there was even a special payment called panhimuyat, which was a present given to the mother of the bride in return for the watchful nights, or in Tagalog puyat, that she had experienced in raising the daughter. Also for the breast milk that she had fed her and often amounted to 1/5 of the dowry. He concludes that, as you can see from the bottom quote, that was the custom that well shows the harshness and greed of these nations, since the mothers wished to be paid even for the rearing of their daughters. So the Spaniards viewed it very differently from the way that indigenous Philippine societies viewed it. Juan Plasencian also notes this as he writes of his experiences in the Tagalog areas of Laguna and the Tinges, the mountains. He says, I'll quote briefly, dowries are given by the men to the woman's parents. If the latter are living, they enjoy the use of it. At their death, provided the dowry has not been consumed, it is divided equally amongst the children. Aside from that, it was also customary for the father of the bride to give a personal gift to his daughter upon her marriage. It's also evidence that the father of the groom, the future father-in-law, also did the same thing. So they would give gifts to the bride to be. And writing of the Tagalog culture areas, Colleen also notes that whenever a chief married any daughter of his and asked a large dowry of his son-in-law, for instance, 18 or 20 taels of gold, the father was obliged to give his daughter certain gifts called pasonor, such as gold chains, a couple of slaves, or something proportional. So these are just from the Boxer Codex, probably familiar to many. I'm just pretending it's like a single man bachelor and a dalaga who are about to get betrothed, just so we have a visual. Domingo Perez, writing in the year 1680, noted that among the Zambals, not only did the man give the dowry to the woman, but also another kind of dowry to all the relatives of the woman. They called the dowry sambon. Among the Tagalogs, it was formerly the custom too, and was called sohol, suhol. So familiar to us as well. So the suhol was the practice among the Sambals of giving this. And in the Ilocano epic, Biag ni Lamang, or the Life of Lamang, it details the negotiations between Doña Inés' parents and the hero who wanted to marry Doña Inés. And there's a very long part of this, and it concludes with this. And this is what the parents require, amongst other things. Imagine two pomelos, also pure Bulawan gold. These are Kanoyan's playthings. Also, the spinning paraphernalia, etc., the clotheslines, all of these have to be of Bulawan gold. So they were essentially asking for like a house and a path, a footpath made of gold. And the reply of Lamang was, well, no problem at all. I am very capable of doing this. This is not even going to make a dent in my wealth. And he says, this is because, and I quote, it will not even exhaust his inheritance from his parents, not to mention what he has taken from the Igorots he has conquered, and his 2 boatloads of gold. So just to show perhaps the grandeur, no, and the expense that somehow sometimes accompanied betrothal practices. But betrothal and the dowry was not the purchase of the woman, but a recognition of the woman's social status and her individual wealth. Doña Inés Canoyan, for one, was esteemed as a weaver, as a wise woman, as a woman who could trade, a very talented woman on her own. This differed from the way it was perceived in Spain, where the dowry was, I quote, property that the bride brought into her marriage to be enjoyed by her husband. For the early Filipinos, the bride price was shared within the woman's kinship group. Property brought into the marriage remained with the individuals, but anything acquired after the marriage belonged to both equally, and more importantly, belonged to the children of the marriage. What exactly constituted the dowry? The payments to relatives, inherited wealth, etc. And for most of the documents that I consulted, the dowry was made up of movable wealth, movable property such as gold, jewelry, as you can see here from the gold implements, the gold earrings, bracelets, the different kinds of jewelry. There's also a Boxer Codex compendium below where you can see the inhabitants of the Philippines at the time wearing chains of gold, implements of gold, etc. So this was one of the major components of the dowry. But aside from that, and most importantly, were slaves or alipin. And as we know, that Philippine early post pre-colonial Philippine society gave importance to labor, and that thus the giving of slaves or alipin was considered important. Again, we have to look at it from the viewpoint of the Filipinos, where it might not be the giving of a person, but the person's labor. This was of great importance in a world of abundant natural resources and land, but scarce labor. Antonio de Morga observes that the slaves comprise the greatest wealth and capital of the natives of these islands, for they are very useful to them and necessary for the cultivation of their property. They also gave certain heirloom pieces such as Chinese Asian porcelain, as can be seen here. So this was the greater part of the dowry. For the marriage ceremonies and practices, Miguel de Luarca described marriage practices and differentiated them according to class. For the chiefly class, the betrothal ceremonies had been completed, the dowry secured, the relatives given their gifts, the wedding can now take place. The bride is fetched from her house on the wedding day, but very reluctantly agrees to go, being enticed almost every step of the way by gifts of slaves, jewelry, cloth, heirloom pottery by her in-laws, especially her father-in-law. Finally, their hands unite over a bowl of rice, and as the quote says, an old man rises, he calls to all, and he essentially declares that the two are about to are want to marry each other. And for me, the interesting thing is here, no? If the man should, through dissolute conduct, fail to support his wife, she will leave him and not be obliged to return anything of the dowry that has been given her, and she shall have freedom and permission to marry another man. Should the woman betray her husband, he can take the dowry, leave her, marry another. All of you are witnesses for this compact. So, um, as we can see, marriage was seen as a contractual thing rather than a sacrament or something religious. It was really a very secular and a very practical contract between the two families. When the old man had finished his speech, they take the clean rice, and the old woman comes up and joins the hands of the pair, lays them upon the rice, holding their hands. She throws the rice to those present in the banquet, and that is the end of the formal marriage rite. What follows after is feasting, often regarded with distaste by the friar observers, noting that it was made up of, I quote Loarca here, Chirino, racket, reveling, dancing, singing until they fall asleep with fatigue and repletion, all helter-skelter without any distinction. The clergy decried the participation of the traditional spiritual specialists, such as the Catalonan and the Babaylan, and the rites that they officiated over, such as the sacrifice of pigs, accompanied with dancing, singing, incantations, intoxications, etc. And Juan Francisco de San Antonio says that the greatest vigilance of the father ministers is insufficient to stop these wrongs, and there are no human forces, although there ought to be, which can banish these pernicious ugalis. For the freemen and the alipin, though, For the freemen and the alipin, there seemed to be little ceremony and payment of dowry. But in the very same document that Loarca says this, he states that when slaves or freemen married, the same use of a woman agent or envoy or go-between was sent to make arrangements, and there were gifts given and exchanged. For Alipin, the masters gave gifts of jars and dishes. So apparently, to me, what this suggests is that the idea of the dowry or the sharing of the wealth was still present, but probably in a lower or a less grand degree than it was amongst the wealthy or the elite. The most common practice in most of the documents that I consulted was to have one spouse. Now this goes in opposition to the initial impression of many of the clergy who said they are polygamous. They have so many spouses, but in essence they would later on say that the practice was to have one spouse. Chirino had lived in the Philippines for more than 10 years before he had been told by another Spaniard of a man in Dapitan, which was very far from the area where Chirino was, with more than one wife. He noted that it is, however, not a general custom in the Filipinas to marry more than one wife, and even in the districts where this is done, the practice is by no means general. The most common and general usage is to marry one woman. The same observation was present in most documents. Apparently, what the friar observers named as polygamy was actually a serial monogamy and stemmed from the practice of divorce, which was relatively common and could be resorted to by both by either the man or the woman. The documents also suggest that social class and status were more crucial in the choice of a marriage partner. Father Chirino, again, writing of the Visayan area, stated that the Visayans always try to procure a wife from their own class and closely connected with them in relationship. The Tagalogs do not so much insist on the latter point. They are satisfied if the wife be not of inferior rank. Loarca observed the same thing, but also said that it was not a hard and fast rule, and that marriages were between chiefs with chiefs, timaguas with those of the rank, slaves with those of their class, but sometimes they intermarry with one another. So the contractual aspect of the institution is seen in the fact that there were penalties imposed on the breaking of betrothals and marriages, and some of these penalties could be quite onerous and steep. Divorce and remarriage were practiced quite easily and commonly. And often, one of the things that caught the attention of the Spanish chroniclers would be adultery. Adultery. This shocked the early chronicles more than the East, more than the reveling and the revelry of the marriage feast. Chirino commented wryly, the marriage lasted no longer than did the peace between them, for they are divorced on the slightest occasion. Morga commented that these marriages were annulled and dissolved for slight cause, with the examination and judgment of relatives of both parties and of the old men who acted as mediators in the affairs. This occurred commonly enough that there were customary practices on the division of the dowry, depending on the circumstances of the divorce. Placencia goes into this in great detail for the Tagalog and Pampango areas. If a man separated from his wife, he lost the dowry which he had given her. If she separated from the man, she returned the dowry which she had received, even though she had children. The property acquired, they always divided equally. Um, Spanish clergy and authorities also were surprised at the very cavalier attitude of the Filipinos towards sexual relations and marriage. And I think this is tied also with their view of women. So as you can see from the quotes here, the men are very fond of their wives. It's the men who give the dowry. And even if the wives commit adultery, it's never taken against the woman, but against I will assume, the male adulterer. And Duarca says, the women are beautiful but unchaste. They do not hesitate to commit adultery because they receive no punishment. The Pintados, the Visayans, love their wives so dearly. In case of a quarrel, they sided with their wives' relatives. So apparently to them, this was a different kind of behavior that was expected. They also observed that the relative mobility and agency of women who could trade and contract on their own or on behalf of others was practiced to a large degree in Filipino societies. They also, again, would comment often on the role of the Babaylan and the Catalonan, who acted as spiritual specialists in their respective societies. Also, very shocking to most of the observers was the sexual freedom enjoyed by women, and this was considered especially sinful when it manifested amongst married women. Um, Antonio de Morga observes this again, and he says the husband's fathers and brothers are not very anxious about it. Adulteries were not punished corporally. If the adulterer paid the aggrieved party the amount adjudged, then the injury was pardoned, the husband was appeased and retained his honor. He would still live with his wife, and there would be no further talk about the matter. Oh, sorry, that was the earlier slide. Friar chroniclers marveled at the treatment of adulterers by Filipinos and wondered it was not a reason for murder and revenge as it was in their own societies. Most put this down to the lack of moral development of the early Filipino, their lewdness, and their loose morals. And again, Morga says, when the husband finds his wife in adultery, he is pacified without any trouble. But since they have known the Spaniards, some of those who assume to be more enlightened among them have resorted to killing the adulterer. So ironically, to them, the more enlightened response was to murder the adulterers. The practice of divorce and remarriage resulted in what the Spaniards regarded as illegitimate children. The friars considered one an adulterer if he or she was living with a second or third spouse and the first one was still alive, even if the first one had no interest in the earlier marriage and was also remarried. A man or woman could have more than one legitimate spouse in his or her lifetime, and all the children from these unions would be considered legitimate. The children from such marriages, as well as those from relationships outside of marriage, were seen by the Spaniards as being conceived in sin, a disgrace, and a burden to their families. In Philippine societies, however, it was common for all children to be recognized, and the rights to inheritance were detailed in customary law, according to the degree of, I suspect, closeness to the current marriage. I will not really go into this because this is an interesting topic that I will probably save for a different paper because it's quite long. So Spanish reactions to betrothal and marriage practices. The Spanish response. Religious conversion came hand in hand with political colonization, and thus the Spanish clergy attempted to exercise greater control over the souls and the lives of the Filipinos. This naturally covered the practices of betrothal and marriage, and which were crucial factors in social relations in Philippine societies. Marriage practices were so alien to the colonizers, they sought to bring these under control and change them to conform more closely to the Spanish model. How did they do this? Some of the methods they used would be to compile census data, enforce baptisms, to hear confessions, to keep tabs of mass attendance and almsgiving, instruct parishioners and observe their conduct, and report on the convocation of children and the possible resistance of their parents. The church thus exercised supernatural sanctions such as, sin, hell, etc., and sought to ferret out irregular marriage practices through the sacrament of confession. Hence, the detailed and intrusive lists of questions that we see in various confessionarios or guides to confessions. Father Sebastian Totanes' Manual de Confesionario has a section on the sixth commandment. I will not go through the whole thing. It's really very long, but maybe I'll just read two. Number 354, did you sin against the sixth commandment of the Lord God since your last confession? Next question, did you sin with some other woman? How many times did you sin with her? Were they married or not? Etc. In your relationship with your spouse, do you think of someone else and delight in the thought of being with that person? Is that other person married? How many times did you think this? Do you have difficulty obeying your husband? Did he become angry by your refusal to obey him, etc.? So these are very, very detailed and to our contemporary minds very intrusive. Apart from this, the church also imposed physical penalties such as whippings, public shaming, exile, torture, and sometimes, well, I have not really seen any, but some people reported, some documents reported that they were told of actual executions, supported, and they were supported in this by the civil authorities. While the church exercised supernatural sanction, which undergirded the authority of the law, courts translated native customs involving property and family relations into Spanish legal terms, eliminating cultural concepts. For example, the dowry as as a recognition of a woman's status now becomes a purchase of a woman, which is of course unacceptable. This was,
Um,
of course, yeah, I'm finishing. A
okay.
slow and uneven process over time resulted in hybrid and syncretic practices. Father Chirino witnessed a wedding where traditional dowry and gifts for the bride were given, it was but it was as here it was solemnized by an Augustinian, but the addition was there is now a generous offering to the convent. So part of the dowry goes to the convent, the parish of the bride. This suggests that in addition or in lieu of the dowry, oh sorry, this suggests that the syncretism was beginning to take place already this early, and this would continue as the centuries went on. So in conclusion, I just put a table here just to see how it was done. No? And as you can see, indigenous practice, dowry as recognition of status was now seen as payment for the bride. Marriage as a contract becomes a sacrament, and deviations from it are seen as a sin. Easy divorce and remarriage with subsequent dowry adjustments. No divorce at all was allowed. And the impact would really be on the lives of women. All children are recognized and inherit in varying degrees, but the Spanish reaction was the invention of what is known as today the illegitimate child. Um, it is also evident that many of the changes would result in various permutations of these two um, kinds of marriage: the Spanish marriage, the Spanish Catholic marriage, and the indigenous marriage. And this there is much evidence to show that this goes on even to this day. So thank you very much. I hope you have learned something from my talk. Thank you.
Good day. This is a presentation of my essay titled Rereading May Bagyo't May Rilim Toward the Tropical Traumaturgy. Here is the outline of the essay. Let me begin by reading the poem. May bagyo't may rilim, ang ulay titigisin, ako'y magpipilit din. Aking paglalakbayin, tuluyin kong hanapin, Diyos na Ama namin. Kung di man magupiling, tuksong mabaw-mabawin, ako'y mangangas din. Itong libro'y basahin, at dito ko hahanguin, aking sasandatahin. Kung dati mang nabulag, ako'y pasasalamat na ito ang liwanag. Diyos ang nagpahayag, sa Padreng nagsiwalat nitong mabuting sulat. Nagiwamat na bagbag, daluyong matataas, ako'y magsusumikat, babaguhin ng lakas. Dito rin hahagilap, timbulang ikaligtas. Kung lumpumat kung pilay, anong di ikahakbang, na ito ang aakay, magtuturo ng daan. Tungkod ay inilaan, sukat pagkatibayan. This poem is found at the end of Memorial de la Vida Cristiana in Lengua Tagala, a book written to explain to the natives the basic principles of the Catholic faith. In it, an unnamed Tagalog poet called Una Persona Tagala responds to the book. In considerably the foremost reading of this poem, Bienvenido Lombera values the text as a fine specimen of early Tagalog poetry, a touching affirmation of Christian heroism. In his reading of the text, Lombera read each self-contained stanzas, a quality he notes that is reminiscent of folk poetry, and in effect outlines the journey undertaken by a supposed devoted Christian. This perceived wholeness in the poem is important for Lombera as it marks the beginning of the tightness of written poetry. This formal tightness can be attributed to the perceived devotion of the persona, as observed by both Rebecca Añunuevo and Rolando Tolentino. In it, religion becomes the primary turn embarked in the journey that is the poem. Religion determines how one must now think, feel, and ultimately move. It can be argued, however, that such reading of the text only furthers this imposition of Catholicism, and by extension, coloniality. Virgilio Almario attempted to counter this tendency through a focus on its subjunctive rhetoric that is more practical in consideration of the Catholic teachings. However, Almario maintains that the poem remains as a demonstration of the colonization of the natives, as ultimately its placement inside the book can be read as signifying of valorization of the Catholic and colonial text. As a counterpoint then to the reading of this poem as submission of a native to Catholicism, the present essay then attempts to reinscribe the poem with pre-colonial folk poetry. In such attempt, tropicality is most instructive as delineated by Hayden White's assertion that troping is both a turn toward and away particular ideations. This simultaneity emphasizes the particularity of the turn's movement. Since an event can be articulated through many different ways, one articulation of it is ultimately and thematically or negatively implying of other articulations as well. This way, the manner and the method, and not merely the discursive subject, are both an argument in itself. Tropicality then does not only pertain to the worldly zone found along the equator, but to an attitude that emerges from the comparison engendered by the tropings. In short, tropicality is also that state of being tropical, or the quality of being tropic that is subject to tropes. These definitions for tropicality as worldly zone and discursive movement find their critical intersection in colonial discourse. Tropes as discursive weapons facilitated the ideological constructions of that worldly zone that was colonized. Tropicality is a subjection of natives to imperial imaginations, for instance, as savages that needed salvation, spiritual and otherwise. And yet, the ambivalent directionalities of the trope must also suggest the chance to turn against the colonial insistence. While a text moves toward a particular argument, it can also be perceived contrapuntally. In other words, with texts such as the poem written by the Una Persona Tagala, one can read it as well differently, and even contrary to its foremost colonial understanding. This way, in reading, one embodies what Walter Benjamin calls material historicism, whose primary task is to brush history against the grain of the most violent storm he names progress, especially in its rendition now as colonialism. Tropicality then permits a syncopation on the poem, that instead of turning toward the eschatological discourse the text seems to point at, one can move instead toward the wounding that is the pilgrimage represented in the poem. This movement away from the coloniality in reading also allows a movement toward a consideration of the said poem vis-a-vis texts that are often severed from it, with folk texts often mindlessly bracketed under the historic period that is so-called pre-colonial. This modifier of pre-coloniality is of course taken with utmost suspicion, especially since the texts presently included in the essay were archived as well through colonial duress, one way or another, and therefore can be arguably classified as colonial too. This way, the essay approaches pre-coloniality as a trope in itself, whose often banal imagination of the archipelago before its colonization can also be an opportunity for the aspiration to undertake the task of decolonization. This contrapuntal reading of the poem, however, is not a simple recovery of a folk sensibility presupposed as uncontaminated by coloniality. Instead, it is a movement toward another imagination to introduce a different time for our archipelago. This is ultimately the erotic potency of the poem, the astonishment in its possibility of being reread again, to be once more begin to plumb its unsuspected enormity, and in effect intuit the capacities for change that are still unturned in the poem. I now begin my detour through a text found in Vocabulario de la Lengua Tagala that appears to be forthright as a philosophical view on the wound or hardships in human life. However, considering its modes of actions characterizing the relationship with the wound, it must be emphasized that acceptance or tanggap and resistance, aayaw or refusal, dimayag, as a pair suggests circulation and exchange. This way, the poem shifts its focus from the wounding itself and toward its aftermath. The primary traumatic event is ultimately displaced as to tend in its place the phenomenology of it. Through the depictive movements in the poem, an intuition toward a possible trauma work or traumaturgy is conceived, articulated through terms of exchange. Jai Jacobo explicates on such thaumaturgy as follows. In relocating the tropes of trauma in an ecology of exchange that is gift giving, Jacobo is able to recognize the agency of the wounded in an acknowledgement of their built in mechanisms of passive resistance. Acceptance is valued as a movement in itself, critical to and constitutive of the object to be received. This way, the gesture of acceptance allows one to transmute the wound taken as a gift too, becoming a total experience whose limits must include even the eventual transcendence from the hurt itself. Therefore, it can be construed that indeed, possibly, the traumaturgic is the threshold to the thaumaturgic. The trope can move through and past the pain of the wound through accepting its totality and toward its potential of emulating the acts of healing. This thaumaturgic effect, however, does not necessarily mean an absolute healing. Similar to how the gift cannot be countered with an equivalent, the poem does not promise an elimination of the trauma. Instead, it only promises a reduction of its phenomenon of hurt, di daramdamin ng antak, which is crucial opportunity toward recovery itself. It is then understood to be the trope at its most ambivalent, that while it turns toward the wound, it simultaneously turns away from it and toward its healing. When the folk is able to activate this thaumaturgic dexterity, a playful thaumaturgy becomes possible, as in this example of folk riddle. The answer is the mouth as enduring feeding. What is peculiar in this particular riddle is its reference of the mouth as a sugat or wound, as if it were a feature foreign to the body, inorganic in the sense that it is possessed only after unnatural violent encounters. In other words, the riddle transfigures the mouth as something that the body can, and indeed must, do without, what the body heals of itself in time. At the same time, however, another solution can be conjectured, for if one is to perceive this riddle as obscene in its tropicality, one can say instead that the answer is the female genitalia. A Kankanai riddle and an Isneg riddle expounds this suggestion. In this riddle, the answer is the female genitalia. As a wound, because given by a god, it is now perceived to be endemic, a part of one's body. In such transmutation, the wound cannot heal or be cured precisely because the wound must not be retained in its being a wound, that is, in its being cut and slashed, especially since it's been given by the divine as a wound. Through these riddles, woundedness is then perceived as a condition of being, since even life itself is an unexpected gift to one from the divine. Life is born from that traumatic moment between the giving and the receiving, especially since the latter, acceptance, is also an endurance of something so sudden and without any apparent reason in its arrival. Indeed, as Jacobo puts it, nativity is the moment of wounding. The first riddle regarding the mouth is then now better understood. As a bodily feature, the mouth is not only similar to a wound, but also particularly similar to a wound that is most anachronistic, a wound that already exists even before its instigation into existence. In other words, the wound is as a mouth is already agape even prior to the spear striking the skin, precisely because the presence of the mouth, its being carved on the human head, has been only made possible by preceding acts of creation that is puncturing too. Therefore, the wound that is the mouth being opened wide is simply an activation of one's dramaturgic dexterity. That since one has accepted this wound, one can turn it as well after one's desire, like to open it wide, even at the prospect of another striking. The Ifugao Hudhud of Aliguyon can be read as an instantation of this tropical thaumaturgy. It is an epic about the war between Aliguyon and Pumbakhayon, whose equal strength and skill made their war last for years without an apparent victor. The repetitive narrative culminates with the arrival of a third, the Ulayan, who intervened to help Pumbakhayon and prove his being worthy of being married to the latter's sister. The Ulayan, however, did not have the equal strength and skill, and so was mortally wounded after Aliguyan threw his spear at him. The Ulayan suffered for an entire year and a half and implied to have succumbed to death. From this interjecting event, Aliguyan and Pumbakhayon realize they are equally matched as heroes and worthy of becoming kings, resulting to an intermarriage between their clans. The Ulayan's wound can then be deemed as the most crucial turn of the epic. Carefully considering it, such is a wound that has been opened even before Aliguyan threw his spear to the Ulayan. Before the traumatic event, an exchange between the Ulayan and his mother Magapid already preempts the trauma. The Ulayan is implied to be incapable of ending the ongoing war. This way, the Ulayan's mortal wounding has been anticipated as soon as he decided to intervene to the war that was not his to take in the first place. His ultimate wound, therefore, is his refusal to accept what has been given to him, to live in peace among his kins. Or, conversely, the Ulayan's true wound to bear was that he was to intrude this war, incapable as he is. For in doing so, the Ulayan allowed the two heroes to realize a resolution to their endless war. As such, the heroism of Aliguyan and Pumbakhayon are only made possible through the Ulayan's acceptance of his wounded fate. Without the Ulayan's dramaturgy, time wouldn't have happened. The heroes would have been still at war, perhaps even until the present day. One can then hazard this tropical dramaturgy as one's acceptance and embodiment, a performance too, if one wills, of their own wounded condition. This way, tropical dramaturgy is a dexterity that maneuvers in the wound an opportunity for an outward thrust from an interior, a palabas that is both spectacle and appearance, disguise and manifestation. In other words, tropical dramaturgy is also modern to the degree that it is reflexive, a mediated exposition. That because the wound is perceived to be a gift, to be accepted, the wound can be taken as how one wants to receive it. This way, the wound ultimately can be in itself a trope. It is a psychological mechanism of defense through which one can turn to another, so that in that moment, with a somehow similar woundedness, there is the possibility of an erotic counter with the other, as hinted in another folk poem. It is in a communal moment of considering one's woundedness, perhaps, the traumatic and the catastrophic even becomes transformative and even thaumaturgic. Now, we move to the reading of the poem. In her brief remark regarding the poem by the una persona Tagala, Año Nuevo identifies its form as that of Dalit, one of the native poetic forms listed in the vocabulario. The San Agustin describes the Dalit as graver and more sententious, in the manner the Greeks and Latins called epic dithyrambic. According to Almario, such comparison of the Dalit only emphasizes the noble and emotional quality of poetry that are embodied by the poems found in vocabulario with 4 lines in octosyllabic measure. This stanza measure has then become the frequent technical definition for the Dalit. Regardless, Año Nuevo's remark to the poem can still be taken into consideration, keeping in mind that Dalit is graver and more sententious. For indeed, what the persona declares in their poem is portentous. What they promise to do suggests of utmost fervency, if not fanaticism, willing as they are to persist through and past the trauma they are likely to suffer. And yet, through the tropical thaumaturgy presently outlined, by accepting these wounding dangers as gifts, the persona is truly capable of overcoming the harshest natural disasters, not through the god that is supposed to have given them the strength, but through their own thaumaturgic dexterity, that sufferance that turns events as opportunities. Through this tropical dramaturgy, the persona, and in turn the native violently subjected to Catholic teachings, is now understood to be not simply yielding to the imposed divinity. Instead, through the poem, the native gestures their insistence, asserting that their body is able to bear the wound precisely because their body in itself is a wound and is wounding itself. Such endurance allows time to open itself toward other possibilities. The enormity of the futurity of opening or kinabukasan, all because of one's potency. In other words, the poem is perhaps a resistance to against the empire by the natives' apparent conviction. In this reading, another folk proverb becomes edifying. According to Noceda and Sanlúcar, this means that the couplet that is dalit pricks like a lampoon. That is, the text is able to tease and to hurt even if one does not stutter in its recitation. Just as then how the persona in the poem claims to read the book just to take the weapon they could use, one can also imagine now the natives putting their faith on this poem by the una persona Tagala as their own form of resistance. That indeed, by the ambivalence of its tropes, by the possibility of erotics these turns offer, they believe to dramaturgically resist. Thank you very much.
Magandang hapon sa lahat. Pamagat ng aking presentasyon ngayong hapon ay 1872, 1898, uri at kasarian sa gitna ng ekonomikong pagbabago ng mga huling dekada ng ikalabinsyam na siglo, ayon sa mga nobela ni Patricio Mariano. No? Part ang sanaysay na ito ng disertasyon ko na recently ay naipagtanggol ko sa Philippine Studies PhD program sa UP Diliman. Siguro magsimula muna ako sa pagpapakilala. Sino ba si Patricio Mariano? Isa siyang manunulat, pinanganak noong 1877. Bahagi siya ng henerasyon ng mga manunulat at intelektual na nakibahagi sa revolusyon ng 1896, no? At magiging prominenteng mga manunulat pagdating ng panahon ng mga Amerikano, no? Kaya karamihan ng mga sulatin na tatalakayin ko ngayon, yung mga nobela niya in particular, pinublish nung American period, no? Pero karamihan ng mga setting nila ay Spanish period. So pag-usapan ko yun later, no? So yan, no? Part siya ng generation na naging part ng revolution, no? Isa sa mga bahagi ng kanyang resume ay naging assistant siya ni Ambrosio Renazares Bautista, ang nagsulat di umano ng Declaration of Independence ng Pilipinas noong 1898. So parang part siya ng circle na yun. Nandun siya sa mga lolos, nandun siya sa Cavite, mga declaration ng independence, mga gano'n. No? So pagdating ng American period, may active siya sa mga newspapers, journals, no? Pero nagiging mas kilala siya bilang mandudula, no? Classic ang kanyang ilan sa mga dula niya, particular yung kanyang Anak ng Dagat, no? Noong 1921. Pero for today, tatalakayin ko ang kanyang tatlong nobela, Juan Masili, ang Bunga ng Nalantang Bulaklak at saka ang Tala sa Panghulo, no? Gusto kong balikan si Patricio Mariano at saka yung kanyang mga nobela kasi yun nga, mas pinapahalagan siya bilang isang playwright, bilang isang madudula, not necessarily as a novelist. No? At kung binabalikan yung kanyang mga nobela, palagi siyang kinakahon bilang isang nobelista ng romansa, o yung kanyang mga nobela ay kinakategorize as ano ba ito? Puro love story lang, no? Yun yung judgment na karamihan ng mga manunulat sa kanyang, karamihan ng mga kritiko sa kanyang mga akda, no? So, yun nga, ayon kay Rizal Juarez, ito ay patungkol sa ang Tala sa Panghulo. Novel elaborates on the elements of our hypothetical conventional plot. One sees in it the movement towards the stereotyping of this plot for purposes of popular instruction and entertainment. Except for a few innovations in the sequence of the presentation and the relative economy of execution, this novel exhibits no significant advance to the novels before. Ang taray, no? Parang interesting daw yung novela pero hindi siya advancement. sa sining ng nobela. Sabi naman ni Soledad Reyes, no, sa kanyang pagsusuri, sa kanyang translation ng Antala sa Panghulo, history in a flux as a result of ongoing interconnected process was frozen for posterity in Patricio Mariano's 1913 novel. In the Star Panghulo, the 21st century reader is offered not only glimpses into an irretrievable past, with its values and ideals, but into psychologically as truth and heartwarming narratives of love set in teeming but threatening world of Manila on the one hand, and the idyllic landscape of Panghulo on the other. So, yun nga, writer siya ng mga kwento ng pag-ibig, madudula, pero hindi siya pinapahalagahan bilang nobelista ng nobelang pakasaysayan or historical novel. No? Pero para sa aking sanaysay ngayon, sa aking panayam ngayon, ang gusto kong i-propose na question, or gusto kong i-propose na parang approach ay, what if basahin nga natin itong mga nobelang ito bilang historical novel? Baka merong sinasabi yung mga nobela tungkol sa pananaw pakasaysayan ni Patricio Mariano in particular, at ganon din sa iba pang mga manulat na kanyang panahon. No? Interesting kasi, karamihan ng mga nobela, ang setting nila palaging late Spanish period. No? Last 4 decades ng panahon ng kolonyalismo ng Espanyol. Which is interesting, considering na sinulat niya ang mga ito panahon ng mga Amerikano. Diba? Bakit niya ginagawa yun? Diba? Again, yung mga naunang mga kritiko, ang sinasabi nila, disconnected yung history doon sa kwento ng pag-ibig, kwento na nangyayari sa nobela, walang connect sila. I would argue against that. No? Na ang totoo ay actually napakahalaga ng kasaysayan para kay Mariano. Dahil binabanggit niya specifically ang ilang mga particular mga taon sa bawat nobela niya. May mga binabanggit siyang mga years. No? Sa Juan Masili, specifically, binabanggit niya 1892. No? Sa ang bunga ng Nalantang Bulaklak, nandiyan na 1898. No? Sa ang tala sa Panghulo, 1872. No? It might be random itong mga years na ito, pero kung familiar ka sa Philippine history, anong mahalaga sa 1892? Founding siya ng Katipunan. 1898, Declaration of Independence. 1872, Cavite Meeting. No? So, hindi basta-basta yung paggamit niya ng mga taon dito sa mga nobelang ito. And I would argue na imbis na hiwalay ang kasaysayan sa mga nobela ni Patricio Mariano, I would argue is actually they are actually intertwined. No? Mahalaga sila. No? Actually, inaapektuhan ng pananaw pang kasaysayan ni Mariano, on the one hand, yung mga nangyayari sa nobela. No? At yun yung gusto kong talakayin ngayon. No? So yun nga, ang tanong para sa akin ay, bakit nakatagpo sa last few decades ng 19th century yung mga nobela? Ano ba ugnayan nito sa katangian ng mga nobela? And then, ano ba yung mga political diskurso na nakipagtalastasan si Mariano? Yun yung gusto kong talakayin for today. No? Bakit ba mahalaga ang last few decades nga ng Spanish colonialism? Now, bagaman napakahaba ng kolonyalismong Espanyol sa Pilipinas, in a way, ang 19th century talaga, ito yung dumanas ng maraming pagbabago, no, sa Pilipinas, no, particular na sa ekonomiya, kung saan higit natutuon ang Pilipinas sa export economy, in particular, export agriculture, lalo na sa pagbubukas ng Maynila sa international trade, at later on iba pang mga regional na mga lungsod sa Pilipinas. No? Babaguhin, therefore, ng pandaigdigang kalakal ng international trade ang ekonomiya at in so many ways ang lipunan din ng Pilipinas. No? Makikita natin to in three things. No? Doon sa gusto ko i-focus ay unang-una, usapin ng lupa, usapin ng role ng babae sa lipunan, thirdly, sa usapin ng edukasyon. No? So, in particular sa nobelang Juan Masili o Pinuno ng Tulisan, pinapakita doon ang ugat ng pagtutulisan, no? Sa at least yung idea ni Patricio Mariano, no, kung ano ba yung ugat ng pagtutulisan noong latter half ng 19th century or at least kabuuan ng 19th century, no? Dahil sa pagtuon sa export economy, agricultural, magkakaroon ng intensification sa tunggaliang panlipunan, no, pagdating sa lupa. No, at ito yung dahilan kung bakit dadami ang panunilisan sa Katagalugan at posible sa iba pang mga lugar. No? Pero pinaka naigting talaga sa Katagalugan, sa Cavite, Laguna, Batangas areas. No? Tulad nga sinabi na Jonathan Fass at Jim Richardson, no, sa Roots of Dependency, the new export economy put a premium on good cropland, and the relative value of all land increased as commercialization proceeded. As value began to rise, land began to fall under the private control of mestizo planters and entrepreneurs who were, in the main, of mestizo origin. And the colonial government was not slow in reacting to this change situation, and the Spanish implemented legislation supportive of the landlord class. No? So sa Juan Masili, siguro quick summary lang siguro. Si Juan Masili, that anak siya ng mga kasama. No, nung bata siya, nasaksihan niya kung paano nilapastangan yung kanyang pamilya, ginahasa yung kanyang nanay ng isang may lupa, makapangyarihan, and then mamamatay naman sa bilangguan yung kanyang ama. Parang mamamatay yung kanyang mga magulang. Nanay niya dahil siguro sa shock at saka sa sa panggagahasa sa kanya, din yung tatay niya dahil kinulong yung kanyang tatay. May aampon kay Juan Masili na mabuting kapitbahay at makapag-aral siya sa Maynila sa tulong ng kapitbahay na ito. Pero sa Maynila, muli niya tagpo yung may lupang lumastangan sa kanyang pamilya. Ang insinuation ay pinatay niya yung may lupa na ito at dahil sa kanyang ginawa. Napilitan siyang mamundok, maging tulisan sa Mateo area, no? Sa may Rizal ngayon, no? Sa Mateo Rizal, Rodriguez and Mateo Rizal area, no? So dito pinapakita nung nobela yung Tunggaliang Panlupa na posibleng parang prevalent nung latter part ng 19th century. At parang interesting sa nobela, ang kontrabida hindi Espanyol. No, hindi sila yung kontrabida dito. Ang kontrabida dito yung mga medyo mayaman na uring Pilipino din. No? So, ang makikita yung social consciousness ng nobela ay mas patungkol dito sa hidwaan na ito sa pagitan ng mga uri. No? Yun yung, in a way, minsan nakakaligtaan no? Sa latter half ng 19th century. No? Nandiyan yung mga Espanyol, no? Lording over everyone else. No? Pero kailangan din tandaan na marami din sa upper class ang take advantage, no? Sa sistema na ito. No? So yun, no? So pinapakita yung Tunggalian ng Panlupa sa Juan Masili. No? Sa iba pang mga nobela, makikita naman ang nagbabagong pagtingin sa babae at paano sila nakikibahagi sa lipunan at ekonomiya ng Pilipinas. No? Common din naman sa mga nobela yung idea ng babae bilang mababa o babae bilang bagay, no? May ito sa mga characters sina Benita, sa Juan Masili, sa Antala sa Panghulo at saka sa si Sinay at saka si Julia, no? Yung mga magulang nila, halimbawa si Benita at saka si Sinay, tinatrato sila bilang property lang. Therefore, yung mga kasal na ginagawa nila, parang ano lang sila, parang para sa ano ba ito? Ikabubuti ng pamilya, no? Pero hindi sila gustong ikasal para sa pag-ibig, no? Si Julia, isa pang character sa Antala sa Panghulo, parang ka-love triangle siya sa siguro mabilis summary lang sa ang Tala sa Panghulo. Ang Tala sa Panghulo, main character ay si Berta, siya yung ang Tala sa Panghulo. Makikilala niya si Luciano, no? Si Berta isang ano ba ito? Tindera. Mga ampaw ba, mga ganun. Mga rice cakes na translation. Ano ba ito? Sa Diliman, no? At color triangle niya itong si Julia. Si Julia actually ay married na, no, by the time na makilala ni Berta, at gusto pa rin niyang ulit makirelasyon kay Luciano kasi ano ba ito? Hindi niya type yung iniwan niya na dati na sila magkarelasyon ni Luciano, pero ano ba ito? Iniwan niya si Luciano para sa isa pang lalaki, si Tino. Pero ngayon magkaasawa na sila, ayaw na niya kay Tino kasi sugarol, etc. Gusto niya bumalik kay Luciano. So may ganun silang love triangle, no? Dito, pinapakita yung mga babae na kailangan silang maki-relate palagi sa asawa nila. Kung hindi, wala silang worth, di ba? Or kailangan kasal sila bilang part ng pagpapatatag ng pamilya, mga ganon. Pero pinapakita din sa mga nobela, ibang uri ng babae, kung saan mas in a way liberated ang mga babae na ito. Sa ang bunga ng nalantang bulaklak, no? Si Pilang, isa siyang sigarera. Makarelasyon niya si Densyo, isang platero in training, at magkakaroon sila ng ano ba ito? Premarital sex, at ano ba ito? Yun yung magiging dahilan kung bakit iiwan si Pilang ng kanyang tatay. Kasi nga na nabuntis siya out of wedlock, no? Pero dahil din doon, kahit na iniwan siya ng kanyang tatay, no, si Densyo, no, hindi niya sinama si Densyo. Actually, inoffer ni Densyo na isama siya sa Iloilo. Tinanggihan niya. Pero yan, kahit na wala siyang tatay, wala siyang asawa, napalaki niya yung kanyang anak, no, dito sila sa Paite. Yun nga, si Berta, siyang tindera. Mamamatay yung kanyang nanay, si Sinay, after siya ipanganak. Yung tatay niya mawawala sa kanyang buhay. Kasi pinatapon nung tatay ni Sinay, yung kanyang tatay, sa pinaresto siya, no? At ang katapusan actually ng nobela ng Ang Tala sa Panghulo, spoiler, muli makikita ang mag-ama doon sa dulo ng nobela. Anyway, dito sina Pilang bilang sigarera, si Berta bilang isang tindera, kinakatawan nila yung mas capitalist na ethic, mas modernong katangian ng babae. Na I think para sa akin, hindi yung traditional na kaugalian, tulad ng sinasabi ni Almari ni Reyes, no? Yung gustong i-depict sa mga nobela na ito. In reality, itong mga babae na ito, mas independent sila. Nagawa ni Pilang na magkaroon ng mabuting buhay kahit na wala siyang asawa at tatay. Si Berta, for the most part, mas independent as compared sa ibang mga babae dun sa nobela. So, dahil meron siyang economic power, no? I think yun yung magandang depiction ng babae dito sa nobelang ito, no? And then lastly, makita din natin sa mga nobela yung halaga ng edukasyon, no? Ulit para sa participation ng mga tao sa nagbabagong ekonomiya ng Pilipinas noon, no? Kailangan mo maging relatively mas educated, no, para maging bahagi sa bagong mga uri ng mga trabaho sa Pilipinas, no? Karamihan ng mga main characters sa mga nobela, halimbawa si Juan Masili, bagaman tulisan siya, nakapag-aral siya sa Maynila, no? Yung mga main characters sa Ang Bunga ng Nalantang Bulaklak, no? Kung di man educated, at least ay merong training sa isang particular na skill, no? Halimbawa si Densyo, karelasyon ni Pilang, no? Platero siya, no? yung anak nila, hindi binigay yung pangalan, isa lang siyang koronel sa Revolutionary Army, ililigtas ni Densho later on, no? Sa katapusan ng nobela. And then kapag nung nagwagi na ang mga Pilipino, ma-realize na, ay, anak pala kita, no? Kasi darating sipi lang, no? Yan, no? Nakapag-aral din itong koronel na ito sa Manila, no? So, again, tulad ng pansin ng recent ng mga historians, no, ang karamihan ng mga revolusyonaryo, lalo yung mga nagpasimula ng aktivista ng Katipunan, for example, hindi naman talaga sila lahat ay lower class, no? Tulad ng parang naunang mga presupposition, no? Example nga ni Andres Bonifacio, hindi naman talaga, ano ba ito? Poorest of the poor si Bonifacio, no? May level of education siya, well-read siya, di ba? Nagtatrabaho siya sa isang, customs house, no? Trading house, no? Na Ingles, no? Marunong siya mag-Ingles, no? Marunong siya magbasa ng French, na konti, I think, no? Marunong siya mag-Spanish, no? So, well-educated sila, no? In a way, nare-reflect din ng mga nobelang ito yung halaga ng edukasyon para sa pagkakaroon ng isang social consciousness, no? So, Juan Masili, nung maging tulisan si Juan Masili at maging pinuno siya ng mga tulisan, binago niya kung paano mag-operate yung mga tulisan, no? Specifically, tinarget na lang ng mga tulisan ang mga mayayaman, no? Reorganize niya yung operations ng mga tulisan para i-target yung mga mayayaman, specifically yung mga mayayaman na nang-aabuso. No, meron siyang term na tulisang bayan. No? Sila yung mga tulisang bundok. And then yung mga nasa bayan, mga tulisang bayan din. So may ganun siya na parang social consciousness, no, na binubuo dito sa mga nobela. No? And finally, lahat ng mga nobela tatapos sa happy ending, palagi sa kasal, no, mga ganyan. No? At in a way, no, nare-reflect nun yung pagnanasa ng mga manunulat, no, ng social stability, ng social success, no, yung kinakatawan ng kasal ni na Benita at Enrique dun sa Juan Masili, yung paglaban sa makasaling interes ng mga mayamang uri. Kasal naman ni Berta Luciano ay kumakatawan dun sa tagumpay ng pagsisikap sa kabila ng pagtutol ng feudal na sistema. Sa ang bunga ng nalatang bulaklak, yung happy ending sa dulo ng nobela ay kasabay ng tagumpay ng Revolutionary Army laban sa mga Espanyol, no? And again, nanggagaling ako doon sa idea ni Doris Sommer na yung mga nobelang ito, romantic novels, no? Kinakatawan nila yung pagnanasa, no, para lumikha in a private space, no, ng kwento ng mga nobela patungo sa isang mas pambansang idea, no. Last two slides, no. Ano yung bakit ganito yung mga nobela ni Patricio Mariano, no? Ano ba yung gusto niyang sabihin, no? In a way, nakipag tunggalian siya kasama na kanyang mga kahenerasyon sa namamayan ng diskurso ng mga Amerikano, which is hindi pa talaga nasyon ng Pilipinas at mga Pilipino. Therefore, kailangan pang i-colonize sila, no? At hindi sabat na naabot na edukasyon at kabihasnan upang pamunuan nila ang kanilang sarili, no? Pero tulad ng argument ng maraming mga manunulat nung panahong yon, kasama na si Patricio Mariano, tulad ng didepict dito sa mga nobela niya, may certain level na actually nga ng development in terms of economy, in terms of society ang mga Pilipino, at least yung Tagalog areas, no, na didepict niya dito, bilang proof, no, na ready for independence ang mga Pilipino, no.
Hi, Christoffer.
Yes.
Hi. Opo. Can you kindly wrap up your presentation for Q&A?
That's right. Again, walang kalampatunan yung mga Filipino sa mga Amerikano dahil as argued nga sa mga nobela, meron ng social consciousness sila, no? Merong in a way parang egalitarian na idea na mamayani doon, no? May interesting na, siguro, tatapos ako sa isang eksena sa ang talas sa panghulo. Happy ending na, nagkatagpo na yung mga magulang, si tatay, si Berta, ikakasal na si Luciano, mga ganon. Nagtapato na sila ng pag-ibig, etc. And then may moments sa nobela kung saan sinabi ng author o ng narrator parang, gawin ko kaya ang ending nito ay mamatay silang lahat sa cholera. May ganun siyang moment. Parang ayokong gawin siyang happy ending. Pero sige, gawin natin happy ending, no? Parang bakit may ganon, no? At again, feeling ko, ako na to, in-interpret ko na yung moment na yun. Ito yung reassertion na nationalist, no? Ang mga makabayang manunulat, gusto nilang i-reassert ang power to narrate yung kanilang sariling kwento. Against the grain ng mga Amerikano, gustong gawin ng mga Amerikano, laban sa gustong ilahad ng mga Espanyol din, previous generations. No? So, yun lang. Para sa akin, mahalagang kasaysayan sa mga nobelang ito. Tingin ko lang ay hindi naging hindi na naging mabusisi ang ibang mga manunulat kritiko sa pag-unawa sa mga nobela. Maraming salamat. Thank you.
Okay, thank you. Maraming salamat, Christoffer, for your presentation. And with that, I would like to call upon Anna, Dr. Habana, Christoffer, and Christian to to unmute themselves and put on video in order to address our audience for question and answer. Now, if you have a question, please raise your hand and turn on your video so that we can call upon you. State your question clearly. Otherwise, you can also use the chat box, and in the case of the audience from YouTube, please send in your questions in the chat and we'll address them. Okay, with that, please go ahead, ask your questions. Okay, do we have any questions from our participants here in Zoom? All right, so while we're waiting for questions, I have a question for Dr. Habana. Okay, so Dr. Habana, you mentioned that when the Alipins would be married, they would also receive dowries from their masters. But you also mentioned something about how the Alipins, the celebration of their marriages were more quiet or so. Could you expand a little more on that?
Yeah, okay. In the documents that I consulted, they would often mention, of course, the weddings of the wealthy because I guess the spectacle was there, and they had a chance to observe it more. But they also said that the masters of the it was if a male alipin wanted to marry a female alipin, and strangely, or well, maybe not strangely, but in the documents they would often say of a slave of the same rank. So as you know, alipin or ripon is very contextualized. There are so many kinds. So anyway, they would give gifts. The masters would give gifts for the male slave to give to the female slave's master, I suppose. Although it's not really very clear, but I think that is how it was done. And normally the marriage is probably approaches what we would call a common law marriage today. It was more by a mutual agreement, and then perhaps there was just a drinking, according to Lower Camorra, etc. They would drink pitarilla. I'm not too sure what pitarilla is. I'm assuming it's some form of alcoholic beverage, and then they would consider themselves married. So they would not have this ginormous feast like the wealthy would have. Like even in today's society, yung kanyao, that goes on for 3 days. There's you consume like 12 carabaos, 20 pigs. Of course, I don't think it was on that scale. So perhaps there was a minor, maybe a small kainan, how we say in Filipino, parang kainan, inuman, and then that was probably it. And it would probably be amongst themselves. Like it would not be a whole social gathering.
Okay, great. Interesting. Thank you for answering my question. And
You're
I
welcome.
see Catherine has a question. Catherine, please feel free to unmute and turn on your video.
Hi, good afternoon. I just have a question for Dr. Testa de Ocampo and Dr. Habana. Yeah, the first
Okay.
question is for Dr. Testa de Ocampo. I'm just also curious as well about the water. So I'm wondering because I know that you said that you're still researching that aspect. But do you have a hypothesis as to what the meanings are and what you've already seen? Aside from the ablutions and all the other things you stated, I'm really just curious. And as for Dr. Habana, because you talked about marriage and about betrothal. I'm curious if there are narratives concerning courtship, because it looks like everything was very transactional. So I was wondering if you also found narratives concerning how they got there in the first place. So those are my questions. Thank you.
Okay, hello, Dr. Anna and Dr. Habana. Were you able to catch the question?
Yes, I did. How isn't Dr. De Ocampo going to answer first?
Okay, okay.
Okay, and talking about the issue of water, there's actually an interesting book by Peter Boomgaard from NUS talking about a world of water. I think it's a trend now in history looking at the Philippines as part of maritime Southeast Asia. So it actually changes the perspective, looking at how we closely interacted with our neighbors in Southeast Asia even before the West had come here. And because of that, there was also these other studies. You can get it from the Cambridge Core or Wiley. It's the papers by Dr. Barbara Andaya, Una Paredes, Stephen Acabado, talking about water as part of our early culture. So with Barbara Andaya's study, she was talking about the gods and the goddesses of the water, looking at the myths and the stories. And it's like when you walk in the mountain and then you don't want to displease the spirits, but you say tabi tabi po. So there's actually an equivalent of that when you want to cross a river or a body of water. You need to be able to ask permission from the god or the goddess of the water so that nothing will happen to you. For Una Paredes' paper, she talks about the Lumads in Mindanao, talking about how while we may now set borders, for example, between different places, like drawing lines against the provinces and all, for the Lumads, the water system, or specifically a river and its surrounding areas, is what gives them their identity. So, and then when you look at the other texts in the 16th century, you will see that the Spaniards actually in relation with water, they would use it as a means for medicine or for cure. So and of course, well, one strange practice was also if you wanted to sleep with the native women, this is in the early part when during like the time of Legazpi onwards and all. If you wanted to sleep with a native woman, you had to baptize them before you had sex with them, which was a little strange if you think about it. But you can only have sex with a baptized woman. So I think in terms of our own culture at this point, we may not have read it strictly as baptism as conversion. But in our own culture, definitely, if they were in Muslim areas, it would be part of ablution or prayer before cleansing before prayer, and at the same time, a kind of cleansing of the self in case you displease the spirits, which is what happens also, or that you have been in a place, for example, like in prison, and you need to be cleansed before you can go back home. I hope I answered your questions. But definitely, it's an area for a lot more research.
Thank you.
Laxon's question about the courtship, no? Yes. When we, you're right to bring this up because when I talk about betrothal marriage, it seems like it's all on the parents, and the parents are the ones making the arrangement. But interestingly enough, although the parents do make the arrangements for the dowry and the betrothal ceremonies and the marriage rites, there is a great deal of courtship that occurs, and I've seen some of the uh, epics and some of the epics which will show this, and there are very very interesting stories, and that is why the epics are such a good source, because it shows that the search for a spouse is exciting, it's invigorating, it involves travel, it involves all of these things, it involves negotiation, wit, etc. And it's really quite interesting to look at that, no? One of the Bohol epics that I found very interesting was this a man who was courting a Bohol. It's a unfortunately, we don't have the original, so it's filtered through the Spanish lens. But he calls her a Bohol princess, so I would assume she's a woman of the higher class. And she sent this suitor to China 5 times on various missions, mainly a jade.
Hi, Dr. Habana. Sorry. There's something. I think there's some static with your audio.
Is it better now? Better now. Now,
Okay, hello? Hello?
yeah, is it better now?
Yes, yes, we can hear you more clearly now. Thank you.
Okay, sige. So, like I said, Bohol Epics, which would talk about this woman who sent suitor 5 times to China for various, like it's like a quest, you know. So she had to bring back X number of slaves, etc., etc. And on the fifth voyage, she says, "I changed my mind. I don't like you anymore," and that was it. So there was no, there was no war. There was no revenge. And the man just like hung his head and said, "Well, okay then. I'll look for another person." Parang ganyan, no? So for me, there was still agency for. It's very important that there was still agency for both the man and the woman. At the same time, if a man wanted to, he had a betrothal, he was already betrothed and wanted to change to break the engagement for whatever reason, it was really quite a simple matter of returning a portion or not reclaiming a portion of his dowry, or sometimes he would just give it up per se to be able to be free. So I think it's like Dr. Lacson said, it's very transactional, and but there was still that element of I would say adventure sort of when you look at it from the level of the individuals. I wish we had more of these. No? I will continue to look. It's hard to do research without archives now.
So true. Well, thank you for that. That was really
Diba?
interesting. Thank
Yeah.
you.
Okay, thank you. And I see that we have a question from Christoffer. Christoffer, please go ahead and ask your question.
Hindi siya question, mas comment dun sa lecture ni Ma'am na Dr. Habana. No, kinasal ako 2 years ago. Connected lang.
Congratulations.
Yun nga, sa amin, ang nanay ko, nag-insist siya na ang family namin, ang gumastos sa kasal. Wala, yun lang. So yung practice na ngayon na yung guys yung magbibigay ng dowry or gagastos, no. Common pa rin siya hanggang ngayon, I think. At least sa probinsya, I don't know sa ibang mga lugar. Taga San Pablo, Laguna ako. So, yeah, nanay, hi nanay, kung nakikinig ang nanay. Hi nanay, hi mahal. Nanonood ata sila. Yun lang po. So, gusto lang i-connect yun yung ancient practice na yon, yung ibang parts nun, I think nagsusurvive pa rin hanggang ngayon sa ibang mga communities. So yan.
Tama ka dyan, Mitch.
Kasi yung 3 kong kapatid na babae, walang expectation na kami ang gagastos, I think. So yun lang. So yeah, nasa interesting nga yung survival ng ganung practices sa kasalukuyang panahon. Yun lang po.
Alam mo, correct. Tama talaga yan eh. Yung hanggang ngayon, di ba, sa atin, it's the man who will shoulder the expenses. So, pero ngayon, syempre, may mga babae, maraming girls na they'll just pay for their own clothes, ganyan. No? Pero the main expenses are still expected to be shouldered by the man and the man's family. Isa pa, yung paninilbihan, siguro na encounter niyo yung word na yun, yung paninilbihan, which is in lieu of or in addition to the gifts, naninilbihan pa yung lalaki. So, syempre, nung araw, yung classic image dyan, yung nagsisibak ng kahoy, gano'n. No? Syempre, ngayon, hindi na. Ngayon, sa atin, mga estudyante, I experienced like a few, last year, one of my students, I saw him in UP Town Center. And then sabi niya sa akin, "Ma'am, anong ginagawa mo dito?" Sabi ko, "Wala. Ikaw, anong ginagawa mo dito?" Ang sagot niya, "Naninilbihan." So, dinrive pala niya at ginrocery niya at tinulungan niya magbuhat yung kanyang, the mother of his girlfriend. So, I was very, I found it very cute, no, that they still use the term paninilbihan.
Okay, great. All right. Well, thank you so much for answering all of the questions. And okay, right. So With that, thank you again to our presenters for their wonderful presentations, and thank you to everyone who asked their questions. If there are any follow-up questions in the YouTube comments, please feel free to share them in the chat, and we'll forward them to our presenters for today. Thank you very much, and we hope to see you in the next session, which starts at 2:45 p.m. Manila time. Thank you, everyone.
Okay.
Thank you.
Thank you. Thanks,
Thank you.
Jillian.
Thank you
Thank
so
you,
much.
everyone.
Thank you.